Hello, and welcome to Masters with Masters. I'm Ed Hoffman, the Chief Knowledge Officer at NASA, and we're here at the Langley Research Center in the Reed Conference Center. We have two guests who will be talking about issues related to lessons learned, knowledge transfer, and systems engineering. And we're hoping that this session is interactive. And so if you're online and you have questions that you'd like to ask, there should be a thought bubble on your screen. You can click on that and then submit your question, and Steve will collect those and get us into some of those questions as we go through it. I'd like to start by introducing our guest here for today's discussion. We have Bart Singer. Bart is the Senior Systems Engineer for the Langley Research Center in the Office of the Chief Engineer. He also coordinates the independent assessment through cost, schedule, and risk for the performance of the different programs and projects that we have going on. It's involved in the development of the review of procedures for space flight projects, and he also leads the Langley Research Center Lessons Learned Committee and engages in a lot of processes with getting practitioners to share some of their stories. And he's authored or co-authored over 20 different research publications. So I want to thank Bart, you for joining us. I also want to welcome Jennifer Stevens. Jennifer is the Chief Knowledge Integrator of the Marshall Space Flight Center, where she sponsors and supports the work of Dale Thomas, who's the Chief Knowledge Officer at Marshall. She leads the Marshall Space Flight Center Lessons Learned Distilling Team, which is a group that's involved in identifying, capturing, and applying the different lessons from the missions of the Marshall Space Flight Center, is involved in the development of policy and procedures for systems engineering, is involved in a lot of agency-wide activities related to knowledge management and systems engineering, particularly with a focus of tools and training and different processes, and is involved in the NASA Knowledge Management Search Working Group activities. I welcome you, Jennifer, as well.
Thank you.
So let me start with basically how both of you got here in terms of your careers. I'll start with Bart. Obviously, you're in the Office of the Chief Engineer. You've led different missions for NASA in terms of projects. You're involved in both systems engineering and projects and knowledge. Can you share how you got interested in this and how you got to where you are today?
Well, so ever since I was a kid, I was kind of interested in things that fly. So nobody who knew me like for my whole life would be surprised that I'm here at NASA doing aeronautics and space flight work. When I first came to Langley, I came as a contractor doing research in aeronautics and then aeroacoustics. And eventually I was hired as a civil servant. And I was going along a career path where I thought I'd spend the rest of my life doing research, writing papers, going to conferences. And then my assistant branch head died, and a lot of us in the branch needed to pick up doing things that we hadn't intended on doing in our lives. And I learned I had a knack for doing some project management things. And so I got more and more interested and involved in doing some project management things. And then I took another career jump. It was going to only be a 6-month detail with the office that helps look over the Langley programs and projects. And I kind of got sucked into the space flight work that we do here and never left that 6-month detail. And so that's where I kind of got interested in space
So the
flight
power
projects.
of details, starting with engineering, and then I guess you learned that you enjoyed the management of projects and helping them be successful.
Yes. And as part of that work in that office, I helped somebody a little too much who came to me for help on setting up a process for lessons learned, and I kind of got sucked into that. So my career isn't exactly a poster child for career development and planning where you want to go, but I think a lot of people that I work with are kind of happy, the way things turned out.
Right. Yeah, no, you do a lot of wonderful. At CKO, it's critical to have folks work in the field, and at Langley you do wonderful work in terms of that. We'll get back to some of those processes. So Jennifer, you've had an interesting career. I mean, you were a contractor for NASA, and then you came over to the civil service side, and as I mentioned, you've been involved, it seems, with a passion in terms of systems engineering and processes, and now knowledge and lessons learned. Can you share, how did you get to this point?
Well, there are people that really enjoy and planned to work for NASA. I really wasn't one of them. Growing up in those those years in the 70s when Apollo had ended and the shuttle hadn't been flying yet, working for NASA wasn't on my radar. I think my dad wanted me to be an astronaut because he was really into it, but I was the kid that got car sick on vacation, so I just really knew that I wasn't going to be an astronaut. So I always liked science and math. I did well. I followed my friends into engineering because there were a lot of things that I just didn't know about possible opportunities and careers. We didn't have the internet back then, so there wasn't as much information about what opportunities we had. And also I grew up in an area where girls were not necessarily actively discouraged from going into engineering, they just weren't encouraged. But I was one of those that just, it didn't matter. I just did whatever I really wanted to do. And I always liked math and science. After I graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering, I got on with Morton Thiokol up in Utah. And it wasn't doing rocket engineering. I was in facilities engineering and then moved to tooling design. And I actually just love tooling design. I love designing things. And the opportunity that gave me was two things. Number one is that I used my engineering curriculum, like almost my whole engineering curriculum, doing tool design and analyzing tools as opposed to focusing on just one specific area. So I used all of my engineering curriculum. The other thing is that I was doing projects from start to finish. So I would get told, here we have this problem, or we'd like to do something, and then I would have to come up with a solution, work with designers, work with craftsmen, work doing the bill of materials and estimating how long it would take to do things. So I was doing project management from stem to stern. If the thing didn't work, the process didn't work, we couldn't make rockets. So I learned how to make rockets, and I also learned project management at the same time, and I did that in Utah for 5 years, and then after the return to flight from Challenger, we had the opportunity to come down to Marshall with a small group, kind of a renegade group. It was just a very small group that supported the materials and process laboratory at Marshall. And with my project experience, I ended up being a project engineer over these small projects. And just whatever came up, I was the project engineer. There was about 5 of us that were project engineers. And you just did whatever. And you did whatever it took to get the product out. And you worked with all the craftsmen. So it was really grounded in how to make things work and in my engineering. When I had the opportunity to jump to NASA in 2000, I was removed from that a step where I was more reviewing those things. And then as I progressed into the shuttle program, and as an integrator, I started seeing more and more and more of the system and putting all that together, so that system view really amplified. So what the contractor gave me was just all that hands-on knowledge, that project management experience, lots of opportunities to grow and learn. And then coming to NASA just broadened my vision in a way that I couldn't have gotten anywhere else. So
in both cases, you didn't come into this as professional in terms of process management or project or in terms of the knowledge area with lessons. It was a case of both liking to do, both building, creating, making things happen, and then seeing the complexity of the engineering systems and the projects and the fact that for it to be successful, the process was something that was of importance and focusing and learning more and getting more involved in that way.
yes.
So let me make the connection to knowledge activities and to lessons learned. And Bart, you were the manager for the airframe noise reduction element of the quiet aircraft technologies activities at the agency that Langley was doing. And so as a manager, in terms of those kinds of programs, activities, is that where you started seeing some of the key aspects of sharing of knowledge, of lessons learned, of the systems integration of things?
So research projects, knowledge
Right.
is actually our product.
Okay.
So everybody was well attuned to this is what you needed to do. You needed to write your papers, go to conferences, talk about what you're doing, and share all of that information. So from a research project perspective, sharing knowledge was just a natural. It was exactly what we were hired to do. I think it's much, much more difficult when your product is hardware or software, and then you need to figure out how to make time to share the knowledge. It's not one of your deliverables. It's something that you should do, that people want you to do, but you're not necessarily accountable for it in the same way.
Yeah, they don't always put it as a line in your budget and schedule.
Yes.
Share your knowledge.
Yeah, that's interesting though, because obviously we're here at the Langley Research Center, which is where you work, and what you're saying is that because of the focus on research missions, that the sharing of knowledge, through different things of conversations, discussions, publications, conferences is a natural part of things. So you would think it'd be more difficult in a space flight, type center. And so Jennifer, you're at Huntsville at Marshall.
Right.
What's your thoughts pertaining to that in terms of bringing knowledge into the kind of missions that Marshall is involved with for NASA?
I have to agree, when you're working with hardware and you're focused on producing hardware, it's very easy to get distracted by that.
Focus is on
The focus is really on production.
Right.
But as Bart said, engineering is also a production of knowledge.
Right.
We are knowledge workers. In the past, in the old age, when they only had documents, they actually did a lot more of keeping logs and writing papers, being active in communities, and doing inter-office memos, really documenting what they did and communicating that way. Now we have all this wonderful, really fast way of communicating, and what we put into it, the content has just lowered as our ability to quickly communicate has increased. So we really, part of what we're trying to do is figure out what the critical knowledge is and how to capture that critical knowledge, how to have that part of the workflow that we do, and get back to some of that discipline where we actually do record those things, and we do inter-office memos, and they're kept somewhere where some people can find them. White papers don't just go into black holes. White papers get kept somewhere. Those various things, so that we do capture that knowledge, because it's so easy to lose it.
Right. I definitely want to come back to the point of the critical knowledge in terms of how do we identify that, how does that get spread. But I want to come back to, I guess, ask both of you, at that starting point, when you're working on the first project or mission, whether it's research or space, how did you get started with some of the aspects of sharing knowledge, of saying, hey, this is an important lesson, let's not lose this? Because you're working with sharp people, with smart people, brilliant people, and I think there's a tendency when people are really smart, one, they feel they know it, so why do I need to capture it? And there's also, I think, probably a tendency of, why do I want to share my expertise with someone else who may take it and compete? Any thoughts on how did you approach that?
So again, in a research project, it doesn't become a question. But as in my more current position, where I'm involved with the projects and going through their technical reviews and all, I'm noticing a lot more of it's not a reluctance to share, but it becomes of secondary importance to meeting their deadlines on the deliverables that they're on the hook for. And so it is difficult to try to get people to, this is important, let's go back and let's document it. And it often involves my noting that it's important and going back to them time and again, and sometimes setting up just a discussion with people. Can we talk about this to try to document it if they don't have the time to do it on their own?
Right. So it's the relationship, it's the skin in terms of, hey, this is important, we got to take some time to talk about that, to capture it.
For me, I hired on with Morton Thiokol 6 months before Challenger, and I wasn't involved in all of the real technical things with the boosters, but I was around that. And then after Challenger, there was a real focus on how do we prevent things like this from happening again, both at Morton Thiokol and in the reusable solid rocket motor project. And so we did a lot of training and a lot of teamwork exercises so that we could make sure that we were communicating. And so very young, very early in my career, I was in an environment that said, you need to talk to each other, as opposed to some more longer standing NASA cultures where they didn't have that so much. And so that was just a part of my early training. I guess I just ended up being at the right place at the right time. And then as I got on with NASA, as I said, as I progressed, I ended up in the integration office, the propulsion systems engineering and integration, where you had to talk to everybody and you were talking between centers. And so talking and sharing was just what you did. And my job was, if I saw something that somebody needed to know, it went to whoever needed to know it. So this job as a chief knowledge integrator is almost just a version of that, where if somebody needs to know something, I make sure it gets there. And if somebody needs information, I do that connection. And I really encourage people to do those connections themselves, to integrate. And that's what I'm trying to encourage at our center, is to integrate between themselves, and then you won't just need a single point. But I think that's really what supported my approach to knowledge and that sharing.
Yeah, the need. It's also, as we were talking here, I was saying one of the things that struck me about both of you is the strong interest and the importance of the systems engineering for the missions to be successful, and then also the emphasis on knowledge. And I asked the question of how does that come together, and you know, I think maybe one of the things you're hitting on is the importance of the integration. Requires the communication, requires that exchange, which is something that systems engineering and knowledge management have in common, and project and effective projects have in common.
Right. Systems engineering is really about doing the right thinking processes up front and getting the knowledge where it needs to get to. And so that systems engineering for me is just really closely tied to knowledge, because that's what you're trying to figure out how people should exchange.
Yeah. And I guess I'd ask you the same thing, Bart, the connection between systems engineering projects and the knowledge, lessons learned activities. Is that how you see it coming together? Or?
Yeah, in fact, we've tried to make that connection more explicit, if you know, in ways that we can. So recently, we've been putting together at Langley our engineering best practices, and we have a clear connection now between when lessons come to the Lessons Learned Committee. We have somebody who's part of that board that looks at the best practices coming to our meetings. And there are times when there are lessons that you know, we ask, you know, does this now go back into the systems engineering best practices? And sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But we've got that communication, like you were talking about, and the connection. And we also try to work it the other way around. Maybe there are things that come up with best practices that got motivated by a lesson that nobody's really bubbled up to the surface. So we try to keep that going in both directions.
Right. You both talked about, you know, having different, you lead different activities, different teams, and part of it is the capture there, and I want to go to that. One of the things I'll also mention to the folks watching online is that if you do have questions for Jennifer and Bart, you can submit your questions through that thought bubble, and then Steve is here and he'll take that and he'll share that. So we encourage questions from the audience. Let me follow up with what both of you have been talking about. Is oftentimes what I see is folks who are working knowledge activities see themselves in that community or the learning community, and folks working projects are in that community, and folks working systems, and you don't get that integration. And I think the key thing that I hear from both of you is success has to happen from that interchange. I know at Marshall, one of the things I consider clearly a best practice, I'm always talking about it, is the Marshall distilling team of lessons learned that you lead a process for, and I was able to meet with the team and see it. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about the distilling team of lessons in terms of people are very busy. You know, as Bart was talking about, folks are, you know, first they want to do their work, and then it's, you know, let's do the work some more. So how did you get folks at Marshall to be interested in sitting down and identifying lessons and who sits on the team, and how do you make that work so well?
Well, our Lessons Learned Committee and our distilling team were really a confluence of a number of factors that were coming together organizationally that supported a real focused, intentional approach to bringing lessons in and training them into our work practices, our best practices, our policy, our guidance, how we do work. One of those things was, and this has to do with Dale Thomas, our Chief Knowledge Officer, who is also our Associate Center Director for Technical. And his purview is really the knowledge and the technical activities at the center, but he also works with how Marshall relates to other centers with the agency. And he's, at the same time that the Lessons Learned Committee was forming, he was also forming a Program and Project Management Advisory Committee, which focuses on how we do programs and projects. He's a systems engineer from forever ago, and so he brings that to the table. And the PPMAC, which he chairs, has members from the heads of all the major organizations at the center. So it's across organizations. It's institutional. It's an institutional focus. It's not just an engineering focus or a safety focus. It's an institutional focus. The PPMAC is also the Lessons Learned Committee, so it's the heads of all those major organizations. And then the distilling team has members of all those organizations that are empowered to take these lessons. So the distilling team does all the groundwork, and then we feed those golden nuggets up to the Lessons Learned Committee. So you have an institutional group that's talking across. You have our group that's talking across institutionally, and then we're communicating vertically. And so that really works with really looking at these lessons and getting them into our programs and projects, our guidance, how we do things, and the systems engineering. It's all just came all together at the same time.
So you have, first of all, you have senior leadership support up to the to the center director level with Dale.
Exactly.
You have integration across the projects, the engineering, and the center community as a whole. I mean, it sounds like you're getting the right people to therefore who validate the importance of this.
You'd be
and the sharing is
surprised.
happening.
You'd be really surprised what somebody in center ops or somebody from a procurement office or just one of these other smaller offices can bring to the table when you have engineers and project offices talking about things that went wrong. They can see things that you wouldn't normally, I wouldn't normally observe.
Right.
It really enriches the conversation.
Yeah, well, to me, one of the key characteristics of programs and projects nowadays is the multidisciplinary nature. I mean, it cuts across, dozens, if not hundreds of engineering disciplines, but also then you have the business field, you have the acquisition communities, you have the learning aspect. So everyone's seeing a different component, and frankly, any one of those falls, and it contributes to a mishap or to a failure.
And lessons that we see aren't just in systems engineering, or they're not just
Right.
in a certain discipline. They often have roots in a number of various disciplines, and we organized and analyzed all the lessons that we looked at about a year ago and realized how cross-cutting a number of the lessons are, and that we needed, when we had a lesson, we needed to take into account those various aspects of it.
A systems perspective.
Right.
Goes
It
back
was
to where
really
we
a
started.
systems
Yeah.
perspective of how to deal with this.
So let me pull, Bart, you do, I know at Langley, a similar process, and maybe you can talk about how it works at Langley, what you do to encourage the sharing and the lessons learned, particularly of, again, space, type projects, not just the research, and what you think is most important. And I know that we have a chart that I think we can maybe show after you talk about some of your thoughts.
So at Langley, our Lessons Learned Committee is comprised of not the heads of the different organizations, but top people, sometimes
Right.
deputies, sometimes chief engineers from the different groups. And we get together, there's one function that to evaluate lessons that come up, but we try to make our meetings broader than that so that we're actually sharing and moving ideas around the center because we've got a nice broad representation. It's a good place to have somebody talk about, in my group, we noticed this, and I just wanted to share this with you, and somebody might come with a few slides to just talk about it. And it's often not a formal lesson that ends up getting documented in LLIS, but the information gets moved around the center. It comes to the committee, it goes back down to different places on the center. We try to do that also by bringing in a speaker at each meeting. I found, among other things, it increases our attendance and participation and gets everybody talking about something related to lessons that we should have learned or we are learning or anything related to knowledge management. So we use the Lessons Learned Committee as our vehicle to help move some of the information around.
So it sounds like, so again, it sounds like obviously there's leadership support. You work for the chief engineer, I think, at Langley. You have the different communities coming together. There's that systems perspective. One of the things you added was that you, I guess to encourage more interest, you have people come at the event. Are they usually from Langley Research Center, people who are working on missions, or are they from outside? Or?
So they're usually at Langley. We don't have a budget to pay for somebody to come here, but we do have lots of people coming and going, and so as I might notice, right. we recently had somebody who was here visiting from the FAA. He was a former NASA person who then went to the FAA, and he was back here on detail, and we got to chatting, and he came and gave a very nice, almost an hour-long presentation at one of our meetings about it.
So it's a time to come together and to share and to exchange. Would this be a good time, to talk about the process and to put it up
sure.
on the screen?
Sure.
So one of the things we'll do is we have an example of the Marshall Space Flight Center Lessons Learned process, which I think is similar to how different folks do it. Certainly the agency level would be looking to encourage it that way. So why don't we put that up on the screen? Ask Ian to do that.
Okay.
And Jennifer, you can explain it.
Okay, we developed this lesson learned process when we developed the Lessons Learned Committee and the distilling team. It took a few iterations, but it was also based on work that we had done at the close of the Ares program and the shuttle program, where we had some very dedicated lessons learned collecting and final report writing so that we could preserve that information, that knowledge for future projects and programs. So we based this particular flow on that. As you can see at the start, we have lesson inputs, and we get lessons from all over. We started out looking at lesson learned reports because that was the most convenient way to get lessons. And we also had lessons come in from various organizations that were part of the distilling team. We found, I guess as Bart has mentioned, that having people come and share their lessons really gives the distilling team a lot of insight into what the issue really was and what we can maybe focus on to solve some problems and infuse that lesson back into what we do. And so, as he said, those are really interesting meetings, and we really enjoy those conversations. We all learn a lot from it, and they're sometimes more fun to attend than other meetings that we have. Right. We bring those in, we capture those. They're not always NASA LLIS submittals. Some of them turn into NASA LLIS submittals.
And that's the Lessons Learned Information System,
right.
For those who aren't familiar with that.
I apologize for not saying that. And we do some screening of them to see if they're complete, there's enough information. We distill them. We try to find those nuggets. And like I said, if you have somebody to be able to come in, that really helps. Recently, actually, though, we went through and downloaded the latest 200 LLIS lessons, and we went through that as a team and looked and found lessons from there that we can infuse into Marshall. So these lessons can come in from anywhere, and we developed kind of a rubric so that we could prioritize lessons, because some lessons you just can't infuse right away. But we come up with recommendations, And those recommendations we present to the Lessons Learned Committee. They take those recommendations and they either like approve a lesson learned information system submittal, or they'll improve a specific infusion. If something's too big for us to actually handle as a distilling team, they may assign another group to address that and come back. So they'll have an action that needs to get addressed. The recommendations, we focus on making them actionable infusion actions that we can, this is something we can actually do. They're not just, oh, it would be nice if we all had good budget and schedule before we started a project. Nothing happens from that. It's always, this is what we can change. This is what we need to address. We need to investigate this more. We need to do some sort of action. And then the infusion is we need to tell these people. So it's an action. It's very active. It's intentional.
Making sure that something's changing, something's happening as a result of the finding of the recommendation.
Exactly.
Of the
Exactly.
activity.
So what we're doing in the distilling team is having an impact. Now, we don't always know what that impact is because the members of the team take back lessons as they get them that apply to them, and they infuse them however they want to and however they feel they need to. And those organizations that are really interested in this knowledge capture and knowledge sharing and knowledge entrainment, they do that. And they've seen the value of it, and they're very actively engaged in this distilling team. So it's been great. So the Lessons Learned Committee can give actions to do infusion, but what it does when you have an organization like this and people catch on that we're here, they send us lessons and they say, oh, you should check out these lessons. And so it helps us
So
to
it
learn.
builds a,
It really does.
A synergy.
It
as
really
people
does.
see it's being used and it's beneficial.
It does, and it's
big
kind of
problem.
an interesting feedback mechanism for how things are going at the center. It's one of those things that you have to be careful because you have this bias of the present. If it's in front of your face, do I need to do this right now? Well, not necessarily. That's why we have to maintain our sense of priority. But
Right.
it is kind of a feedback mechanism. We have found that in some of our young, inexperienced project teams that they didn't know to do something that us older people just think are does. And so we've had to re-examine, okay, how are we training our younger people? Are we neglecting to
That
teach
gets
them?
into the whole
yeah,
knowledge transfer.
it gets
kind
into the
of
whole
issue as
knowledge
well.
transfer, yeah. So it's a very interesting insight into how the center's operating that I don't think that we would have had if we hadn't intentionally looked at these.
Right, the intentionality of bringing people together, experts who are working, in the field on the actual activities and dialoguing.
Right.
I want to come back to the
I have a
issue of
question.
knowledge. Yeah.
So what kind of time frame do you get some of that feedback in? Because we had a group come to the Lessons Learned Committee with a number of processes, center processes that weren't working for them. And so we had a good discussion, we brought some of the right people in, but actually getting those processes changed or even investigating how much should be changed, is this a project-specific problem or is this really a center-wide problem that we need to make center adjustments on? It just takes a long time, and the people that first submit these concerns tend to get discouraged.
It does take time. That's one of the hardest things to deal with is you want to make change. There's a lot of people who have been thinking about a lot of these changes for a long time, and they've been wanting to do this. I had one gentleman, when he found out I do lessons learned, he's like, we never learn our lessons. It's, one more time, we're not going to learn our lessons. But like I said, this has been a confluence of a number of different factors where this PPMAC deals with the guidance and is looking over the programs and projects, and we're really bringing these things together, and we have this institutional view and a motivation with the demographic problems of people retiring. All of these things are really coming together where there's a strong motivation in our leadership to learn lessons and work smarter. As far as our process, we used to meet weekly, and it was a little easier to keep the momentum going. We had to go to every other week just for certain concerns. And it does take time. The time between when someone writes a lesson and then when sometimes we distill it can be a long time. They have to jog their memory. But we also sometimes take weeks or several meetings to be able to get down to a point. You just have to have patience, and we do take the approach that we aren't trying to eat the whole elephant, that out of small things great things can come to pass. Sometimes they're just little corrections, but we're trying to get us all moving to a positive in a positive manner. I think what's really happening, what happens with our process isn't the process so much, it's the thinking, it's actually the hope. For me, it's the hope that it gives people that we're actually doing something, that we're trying. There's a lot of energy out there, a lot of grassroots energy out there that wants to learn lessons, that wants to do their processes better, and they want ways to do it, they just don't necessarily know how to do it. One of the things we find is that leaders are thinking they want to do things, and people are reinventing processes in their isolation. And part of the integration is to get people together so they're not reinventing the wheel all the time. And that's another thing with the younger people, is sometimes they'll spend a lot of time thinking they have a great idea when it's something that was invented 15 years ago and looked at. So we're really trying to eliminate that wasted work by getting people aware that we exist. And yeah, we do have, there's a delay.
So I'm
never
actually
fast.
glad to hear that, because it's not as discouraging for me when, you know, people came and we thought, oh, we can change the world and we can do it now, or maybe not now, but tomorrow.
Right.
And
Right.
tomorrow is just still a few days away.
Well, yes, but there is this change in the systems engineering world where we're going to model-based systems engineering. And I know that's not the subject of that, but model-based makes us change our focus from all these documents that we've always used to what is actually the data and what is the thinking that needs to go with that. And with model-based, you actually can burn in some of your best practices just in how you're doing model-based instead of how you were doing systems engineering. It's really challenging us right now to focus in on what are we doing, what are we trying to do, what's really important as far as this data and information is concerned, because it's going to be going into a different form and coming at us in a different form. So all these progression into the future generations is challenging how we need to think about lessons and knowledge and that infusion.
Yeah. It sounds like, you know, so there's more of a use of reality-based factors that impact behaviors, and all tied to what's helping the work get done, the missions be successful, which is, again, the systems, the integration, the communications, and that consistent, you know, as long as people can see, I guess, you know, I usually talk about small wins. As long as
Small
people
wins.
see something happening, then that gives the hope or the motivation to keep going. If you don't see anything ever, you know, changing,
Right.
then, you know, then that's a different story.
Well, it's catching on that it's easier to do a project if you're smarter at the beginning.
Yeah.
It-
Basic principle, but
right,
yeah.
it's a
we all-
basic
yeah.
principle, but we do have this
Yeah.
tyranny of the urgent where
Right.
people are like, we didn't have time to spend a week figuring out what we meant by all this stuff. We didn't have time to figure out what we were really working on. And that causes a lot of project problems. And we're really fighting that with all of these committees and that we have going on.
Yeah. There's much more of a focus also in terms of the knowledge and the learning, because, again, let's face it, in the last 10 years, the information, the competency, the technologies, the tools, the approaches have just constantly, you know, they change so very fast now. I mean, when I got to NASA quite a while back, from a training standpoint, we could develop a course. That course would probably stay intact for 10 years. And nowadays, once you've designed something from a learning standpoint, it's already dated. You have to update it. So that kind of pushes more pressure on how do we learn, how do we come together, how do we keep moving forward.
Exactly, and all the different technologies and the forms that information takes. That's one of the reasons why this knowledge management search working group is so needed,
Right.
is because those forms of knowledge are just changing. How do you deal with that?
How do we just keep up and find?
Right.
Let me see from Steve if we have any questions. So,
We actually have a lot of questions from online, so we'll try to
Okay.
get through as many as we can. The first is actually from Inside NASA from NESC, and it's for everyone. Can you think of an example of a specific best practice or lesson learned that was used to help a project be successful or planned in a successful way?
so questions around examples of, where a lesson learned has led to, success.
Right. Do you have any? I have one. We had a lesson that was, I think, actually originally started from Langley, but a Marshall person wrote it up so that it came to our distilling team. And it had to do with curing a large, expensive composite part, and having to do these parts with long lapses, like a year between the time that they did them. And they made two that were good, and then the third one, they had a problem in the process and they lost the part, very high value. So when it came to our distilling team the first time, we decided it did need to be an LLIS submittal, and our SLS representative looked at that and she said, we're talking about that kind of thing right now. And so she took it back. And actually, because of my materials and process background, I thought it was just a question of, oh, hey, they don't know how to vacuum bag a part. But others in the group said, no, this is one about knowledge capture of a process and how the documentation doesn't do it. And when we have these things where we're going to do them on long centers, this is a real problem. So she took it back and they changed and did more investigation and more decision making on how they were going to capture process knowledge, because you don't have to just do documentation. There's videotaping, there's all kinds of options. So you need to take the box off of your thinking that you have to do it the same way. Well, it's interesting because, as I said, we went through and gathered all these lessons learned from the Lessons Learned Information System, and as we were going through them just recently, she came across that and she goes, that is a really good lesson. I'm going to take that back again and check with these guys and make sure that they've done something. And that is a big problem for us. And if the person that wrote that hadn't thought it was important enough to write it down, which he was actually not really encouraged necessarily to write things down, but he thought it was important enough to get it in there, so he took the initiative to do it. And it has turned to be something that we've had to really reflect on.
But I think this question raises some other good questions in terms of people put lessons in and they often don't know what kind of impact they had. And I think there's a lot of people at NASA that would be far more motivated to enter good lessons if they had some feedback that somebody entered something and knew that it actually impacted another project. There's many lessons that impact lots of projects, but we never know about them because they don't.
Yeah,
there's no feedback loop on it.
And maybe, one of the questions you usually get is how do you measure? And I guess if there are a way to make a connection between a lesson or a body of lessons and how it impacts. I can think, I remember about 20 years ago, one of the issues I was remembering a project talking about, they didn't do a risk management plan, which nowadays would be, insane. You couldn't do it. And their justification was that I'm going to tailor out risk management. And certainly over many lessons. And that lead to, communicated lessons lead to experts basically saying this should be a standard, or this should be a policy, or this should be how we adjust things as an organization. Now there is a policy in place saying you have to do risk management, and how you do it is, can be unique to the team. But to me, that's an example. And you can see that in other things. You can see that in terms of use, in terms of the estimating of cost, or earned value type tools and approaches. There are things that we either didn't do 20 years ago, or we did more inconsistently, where now it happens. Learning, what we're doing in terms of lessons learned and training is something that was much more hit and miss, certainly 20, 25 years ago. So sometimes it's hard to see how an individual lesson maybe changes things. But I think when I know how the agency operates, when they see things coming up, on a pattern of these are key issues in terms of systems engineering, of risk management, of learning organizations, that leads to the standards, the policies we have. So,
Right.
but it does go back to, I think, what Bart, you also hit on, is that it's not easy to see
Right.
how my lesson has impacted something. That maybe that's a way to look at it for measurement.
And I struggle with that on the distilling team because managers want quantifiable evidence that what we're doing is the right thing to do. And if you ask the distilling team members, they know what we're doing
Yeah.
is the right thing to do, because even if they don't have quantifiable evidence, they know how it's impacting their organizations. But what we found is that we will go through these lessons like on the LLIS system, and our center has been changing their policy to be in line with agency policy, but also to really be in line with what we need. And so that's been morphing as we've gone through this lessons learned distilling team process. And we have encountered where we've come across lessons and we'll go back and we'll find it's already been implemented in policy. And that's encouraging that they implemented things in policy. They did learn their lessons back in the day, or in the past 3 years or so, and they've changed the policy, and so we don't really have to worry about doing an infusion ourselves, because somebody did learn the lesson and they have already fixed the policy or the guidance or whatever they're.
Yeah, and I would say, again, from a vantage point of what I've seen at the agency, I think NASA on a whole does learn, actually. I know we always talk about we don't learn the
we
lessons,
do.
but
We actually do.
the place does, and any time, particularly when there's a failure, I don't think we're as good when things are successful, learning from that. But when there's a mishap, I see really closely how these things are taken seriously by the leadership, by the community, and particularly in the domain of interaction, communication, we just talk about as being so very important. But there's much more of a focus from these lessons of we need to be collaborating, we need to be communicating, and that becomes part of how we train our people, select our people, work together in the missions we do. And I think, again, ultimately those are lessons that take place in some way. But so
Right.
let's go back to Steve for another question.
Sure. We have another question from online. Did you ever capture a lesson that was awkward for the people involved? How do you protect individuals for what they might think will be perceived as a dumb mistake?
So question of capturing lessons that are hard to deal with, that, how do you protect people who maybe are involved in that, and the difficulty of often lessons come from mishaps or problems or failures. So any thoughts?
So
Bart?
the lessons often involve stories, but there's often a lot of information in those stories that are irrelevant to the lesson. So you don't necessarily need to know specifically who, at least not by name, did something. It could be a contractor if that's necessary, or it's just a participant if it's not necessary that it was a contractor. So by first going through and making things that aren't pertinent to the actual lesson anonymous, or making them more amorphous, I think that helps people.
Depersonalizing.
Yes.
Right.
It becomes, we're focusing now on the lesson and not on who did what. I think that, and by going to people and telling them that you're going to do that up front, it gets people to help talk about things a lot more. So that's one way. Also, if there's any implications to the lesson that need to be dealt with, that needs to happen before it actually becomes a lesson. If there's still legal implications or something else, our Office of Chief Counsel or other appropriate groups need to handle that before we actually deal with it as a lesson. And we make sure of that after lessons by making sure that they go through the right vetting process so that nothing becomes public that shouldn't become public.
Right. We have a vetting process in LLIS so that those kinds of things are protected. I found the question kind of interesting because we have had some lessons come through the distilling team, and you would have the person who was involved with it say, well, let me tell you how this really went. And so they'll share that with the distilling team, and we'll get more insight into what's going on and what the problems really are. when leadership, especially Riskevich, used to talk about how when you have a mishap or something, you bring up the same, usual suspects, and a lot of times it falls into that. We have some systemic problems, but when you get these people sharing what really went wrong, sometimes you can target focused areas where you can correct things, and you don't have to use people's names. I took a page out of Ed Rogers' book on how to write case studies, in that he says, well, some of my case studies never see the light of day. It's because people are still sensitive about it, or you can't get a whole story. And so not every lesson that comes through the distilling team is going to make it onto an LLIS. It's not necessarily going to make it anywhere past maybe management or whoever needs to see it. But at least we have more background to approach problems with more information.
Yeah. I mean, I also think one of the key issues, I mean, this is one of the things I've learned, is to not to turn it about a person.
Right.
Because first of all, it's easier for the larger team or an organization to, we figured out the problem, it's that person, and that's almost never the case. One of the things that we know about complex systems, about engineering, about projects, is that it's a team effort. And so I think it's important to focus in terms of what are the symptoms, what are the issues?
What are the,
Do that root
real
cause,
issues,
and then,
right?
And how do we address that? Otherwise, it becomes a,
Right.
a different kind of a thing.
When we did Aries Lessons Learned distilling, people would write things that were just, management is terrible. It's like, I'm sorry, we can't make
Yeah.
management any better.
Yeah.
That's not specific enough. That's why we focus on trying to get to specifics and trying to get to action.
Yeah. It's also, I mean, I think one of the real positives of failure, I mean, as long as it's not, catastrophic, but I mean, failure drives innovation. We know that particularly a lot of the younger companies, entrepreneurials, they always talk about learning from the different failures we have. So I think to the extent that we create an environment where the mistakes that are happening or the mishaps are seen as, something that, okay, that's cool, we were doing something different, we're doing something, cutting edge, and now how do we take it? Because then somebody else will see it and not only learn from it, but is probably able to develop something that goes further than we could have before. But it requires that mindset.
It does.
So, Steve, anything else? Or?
Our next question is, once actionable corrections or approaches have been identified from lessons learned, how does Marshall and Langley, how do they track the effectiveness of the changes that are implemented institutionally?
So how do you go about tracking whether things change, whether things improve? Is there a way to do that? Or?
Well, we do capture all of the recommendations that we make as a distilling team and try to track that. I'm sure that we're not capturing anywhere near how much effect that we have, because we do have people that take the lessons back as we make people aware, more generally aware. That's part of Infusion, is to just make lessons generally out there so that people can see them. We have opportunities to make monthly safety topic presentations out of lessons. So there's ways to get lessons generally out there. The fact that, like, as I said before, they know who we are and where we are and what we do makes people more aware to share lessons.
Right.
So it's really hard to get quantifiable evidence of the impacts. The easiest way for us is because of our close association with the policy and the guidance writing.
That's pretty powerful.
We know what
Yeah.
we're changing there, or we know what's already been changed in accordance to these lessons that we've learned. And then the PPMAC oversees these programs and projects that are implementing this policy and guidance, and they're seeing whether or not these things are actually being taken care of and done.
So you track, you see,
We do.
you see things that do change and get better, and some of it gets to the point of policy and issues. I guess,
Right.
Bart, how do you go about, do you see improvements from some of the things, or things get, somewhat better?
So I think things seem to get somewhat better. We don't have
Okay.
any formal way of
Right.
tracking it. It would be interesting to do, but it's probably more work than people currently feel would be
Right,
worthwhile.
it's that issue of how much do you put into the measuring and tracking it.
Yes.
Okay. Well, people still are coming back. So, I mean, one of the things I've always, I guess I've loved about NASA is that I found it early days is that if you do something and people don't like it, really quickly they just stop
They just stop.
showing up. And if you're doing
Right.
something that people keep, we were doing one activity around knowledge forums in the early years, and I was talking about, you're always wondering, how do you know? How do you measure it? And one of the senior project folks who've been around a long time saying, look, as long as we're showing up, you're doing okay. Once we stop showing, so
When
it's
you
a little
start
bit,
showing up.
probably needs a little bit stronger of a connection there.
I'm
Well,
really,
one thing that
go ahead.
one thing that we've discussed doing, but it's a long time frame kind of thing, is to watch whether lessons start reappearing. Things that we should have learned show up
Right.
again and again, because that would mean that we haven't actually learned those lessons, and we need to take some steps beyond what we think we have already done.
Or it could be that the domain is so complex, because again, if I look at a project or a system, there are certain things that are all over the place. Risk is so many different places. The costing, the business side is so many places. The teaming, the human aspect. And so the fact that there are always issues coming up, in terms of how we work with each other as people, it's probably always going to be coming up because it's hard, and there's always other things. But are we making progress? Is maybe one
Exactly.
thing.
Well, and as I work with people and find out which groups are working on knowledge, so I can talk to other groups about and share those kinds of things, I find out how many people and groups are actually interested and focused on learning their lessons, and they do have processes. So there are groups that actually have processes, and they've been doing their processes for quite some time because it's of value to them. And for me to hear more and more groups using lessons learned and asking about lessons learned so that they can get smart at the beginning of a project or an event is an indication to me that it's catching on. And I've been seeing this growth in a couple of organizations. I've seen them use our ExploreNet social media to share their lessons learned. I've seen a couple of other organizations just go out and do the searches and ask me where they can find things. So as I see people really start doing this, I feel like it really is growing.
Yeah, and I guess you can feel, I mean, both of you come off as very passionate that you're enjoying what you're doing. So either you're good actors or you're enjoying it. So, and
We're
I'm
not
a
good
believer that if
actors.
you're a part of something that's working, that it feels good. I see that we're coming down to the final few minutes, so I did have a couple of things, and maybe I'll give each of you a chance to go in a direction. I was hoping to get into a little bit of a discussion on critical knowledge, because one of the things that I've seen is there's so much in terms of expertise and knowledge and lessons that if you try to deal with everything the same way, it could just drown you. So, one is how do you deal with identifying what is critical and what is not? And the other thing I'd ask is where do we need to go in terms of how we learn and how we develop and how we make sure that the transfer of knowledge is taking place? And I'll leave that maybe for each of you. I don't know
Go
who
ahead,
wants
Bart.
to start.
So we're in the process of doing this at Langley. Actually,
Okay.
Manjula Amber is
Right.
leading she's our center CKO, and she's leading our effort to put together a Langley knowledge strategy to address exactly the kinds of questions
Right.
that you're asking. And there's a lot of unknowns on how to do this,
Right.
and so we're exploring the broad range of things that we can do with the constraints that we have.
So early stage, but there's a team,
Yes.
and obviously Manjula is the Chief Knowledge Officer for Langley, and so there's a planning and looking that over. Jennifer?
Well, I think part of this is that we never didn't know what critical knowledge was because we shared it before.
Right.
We just got into bad habits of how we documented it or how we kept it. And also the fact that it was on paper and people have, file drawers full of paper and it's not accessible. So that access problem really becomes an issue. So part of it is getting back to the discipline that we had before of just the logbooks and the interoffice memos and keeping papers and making those things accessible. That's that discoverability and accessibility of knowledge. We also have, one of the lessons we've learned is that the use of email
Right.
has been a problem. And so we have a team that was directed by the Lessons Learned Committee based on a distilling team action or recommendation to go and look at how we use email and how we can have some sort of center guidance or direction on how to best use it so that we can capture that critical knowledge.
Well, so keep moving forward.
Keep moving forward.
Identifying the critical things.
Right,
And
and that we do have the question though also about the long-term data retrieval and storage that we
Right.
have to address. And
Which is
so
a
the
big-
IT people,
big issue.
right, the IT people are really concerned about that.
Yeah.
So those are all on
And
our horizon of
And the
things that we
digital
need to deal
world
with.
makes it both better because you have it, but who knows how long it lasts and all the different
Right.
formats.
Well, and there's also how do people process knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
And we're throwing out a couple of different ideas about how to present knowledge. Could we use something more like a Wikipedia format because people are familiar with that? We go to Google a lot, but would another format be more compatible with how we cognitively process it? So those are some options that we
A lot of
can
key
think
things.
about.
I see we're up at the hour. I'm assuming that we should be closing out now. I guess I'll look for at that point. Okay. So I do want, as you can tell, I've had a wonderful time. Obviously, this is an area of great interest in terms of lessons learned, knowledge transfer, the way we get people to learn. I mean, I believe that one of the key challenges we have as things become more complex and we have multidisciplinary teams coming together, it's how do we capture what we're doing well and keep it going, and things that aren't working, how do we stop it? And so I laud and I appreciate the efforts and working with both of you, for a while on that. So I want to thank Jennifer Stevens of the Marshall Space Flight Center and Bart Singer of the Langley Research Center. Also want to thank the team here that Hope Venus has put together with Steve and with Ian and with Nia. And also the voice of the questions is Steve Cutright. I want to thank all of you. This is a challenge in terms of coming together, but I feel it's been really worthwhile. And so I thank all of you. And if there are other questions, I think if you submit them, we'll try to go through those and respond to them in terms of our websites and the different approaches you have. And you can track this in terms of km.nasa.gov. And again, if there are follow-up questions, we'll look to respond to that. And I thank you for your time and hope the next time we do this, you'll come back.